The Arctic trade war has already begun, not with declarations, sanctions, or explosions, but quietly, bureaucratically, and beneath melting ice as global powers race to control the fastest emerging trade routes on the planet. For most of modern history, the Arctic was irrelevant to commerce, sealed by ice, darkness, and extreme conditions that made large-scale trade impossible. But that reality has collapsed in less than 2 decades as rising temperatures have reduced summer sea ice by more than 40%, turning once impassable waters into navigable corridors for weeks and now months at a time. This shift is not theoretical, it is operational, with commercial vessels already transiting Arctic routes, insurers rewriting risk models, and governments repositioning military assets northward. What makes this moment dangerous is not simply the opening of new routes, but the speed at which they are becoming strategically valuable, offering shipping paths that can cut up to 40% off traditional transit times between Asia and Europe. A ship traveling from Shanghai to Hamburg through the Arctic can save nearly 10 days compared to the Suez Canal, reducing fuel consumption, crew costs, insurance exposure, and vulnerability to choke points that have become increasingly unstable due to war, piracy, and political leverage. Every day, saved translates into millions of dollars and, at global scale, trillions in trade value. Control over these routes means control over who benefits from this efficiency and who is excluded. Russia recognized this first, treating the Arctic not as an environmental zone, but as a sovereign highway, reactivating Cold War-era bases, deploying air defense systems along its northern coast, expanding its fleet of icebreakers to more than 40 vessels, and formally asserting authority over the northern sea route. Moscow now requires foreign ships to notify Russian authorities, accept Russian pilots, and pay transit fees, effectively turning the Arctic into a toll road under Russian supervision. This is not regulation for safety alone, it is leverage, and it allows Russia to shape who moves goods, when, and at what cost. China, despite lacking an Arctic coastline, understands the implications, declaring itself a near-Arctic state and integrating polar routes into its long-term trade planning through what it calls the Polar Silk Road. Beijing's motivation is simple. Arctic routes reduce dependence on sea lanes dominated by the U.S. Navy, particularly the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea, where American allies and warships can restrict Chinese trade during crises. By investing in Arctic research stations, ice-capable vessels, port infrastructure, and energy projects, China is positioning itself to benefit from routes it does not control but cannot afford to ignore. The United States, meanwhile, enters this trade war from a position of strategic delay, having spent decades assuming that the Arctic would remain marginal and that international norms would prevent militarization and exclusion. That assumption no longer holds. Beneath the ice lie not only shipping routes, but vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and critical minerals essential for energy systems, electronics, and military hardware, making trade access inseparable from resource extraction and transport. Whoever controls the routes controls the economics of extraction, the insurance of shipments, and the security of supply chains. The Arctic also shortens military distances, offering the fastest paths for missiles and aircraft between nuclear powers, which is why early warning systems, submarine patrols, and satellite tracking are increasingly focused northward. Greenland, Iceland, and northern Canada have returned to strategic relevance not because of population or industry, but because geography has shifted beneath them. Greenland sits at the crossroads of Atlantic and Arctic access, adjacent to emerging trade corridors and rich in minerals the global economy increasingly needs. For the United States, this is not simply about shipping. It is about whether American power remains embedded in the structure of global trade or becomes reactive to routes controlled by rivals. The post-war global order depended on American dominance of key sea lanes, allowing Washington to act as guarantor, regulator, and enforcer of maritime commerce. The Arctic threatens to bypass that system, creating parallel routes outside traditional frameworks, and unless the United States asserts influence, it risks watching a new trade architecture form without it. This is why the Arctic trade war is not coming. It is already here, unfolding quietly as ice retreats, ships move, and rules are written by those present rather than those absent. What makes the Arctic trade war uniquely dangerous is that it is being fought without formal conflict, through infrastructure, regulation, insurance, and access, mechanisms that rarely trigger headlines, but determine power more effectively than force. Russia's advantage lies not just in geography, but in readiness, possessing the world's largest and most capable icebreaker fleet, including nuclear-powered vessels that allow year-round navigation and enforcement. This gives Moscow the ability to guarantee access to those who comply and deny it to those who do not, turning safety requirements into political tools. Every escort, fee, and permit strengthens Russia's position as gatekeeper of the northern sea route, and every commercial success normalizes its authority. China's strategy is more patient, focused on embedding itself economically while reducing vulnerability. By partnering with Russia, investing in Arctic energy projects, and developing its own polar-capable fleet, Beijing is hedging against future exclusion while quietly learning how Arctic logistics work in practice. The United States, by contrast, has fewer than a handful of heavy icebreakers, limited deepwater Arctic ports, and fragmented governance split across civilian agencies and the military, a gap that limits its ability to shape outcomes. This matters because trade routes do not remain neutral. They reflect the priorities of those who secure them. If Russia and China dominate Arctic transit, they gain leverage over supply chains that affect energy prices, manufacturing, timelines, and food security far beyond the polar region. In times of crisis, access can be slowed, restricted, or politicized, forcing states and companies to choose between compliance and disruption. From a U.S. perspective, the loss is structural rather than immediate, erosion of the systemic advantages that allow influence without occupation. Arctic competition also pressures alliances, particularly among Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, all of whom face growing traffic through waters they either claim or depend on. Canada's Northwest Passage, long considered internal waters by Ottawa but an international strait by Washington, is becoming increasingly navigable, raising questions about sovereignty, regulation, and cooperation. The United States has historically defended freedom of navigation, but in a more crowded Arctic, rigid legal positions may give way to strategic compromise, especially if alliance unity becomes essential to counter Russian and Chinese influence. Greenland's political future adds another layer of instability, with growing interest in independence creating openings for external leverage over territory that lacks defense capacity, but occupies one of the most valuable positions in the Arctic. The trade war will not be decided by who sails first, but by who builds the systems that make Arctic commerce reliable, predictable, and insurable. Ports, search and rescue capabilities, communications networks, satellite coverage, and environmental response infrastructure all function as dual-use assets, serving civilian trade while enabling strategic control. Russia understands this and has invested accordingly, while China learns quickly by participating. For the United States, the risk is not confrontation but absence, because absence allows others to define norms, prices, and access rules. The Arctic trade war also illustrates a broader shift in global competition, where climate change accelerates geopolitical change and infrastructure becomes a weapon. Trade routes are no longer fixed by geography alone. They are shaped by technology, regulation, and environmental transformation, and states that adapt fastest gain disproportionate influence. The Arctic exposes how fragile the existing trade system has become, dependent on a handful of choke points vulnerable to conflict, sanctions, and disruption. As these traditional routes become riskier, alternatives grow more attractive, even if they are harsh, remote, and politically contested. The danger is that competition hardens before cooperation emerges, locking the Arctic into a divided system where access is conditional and power concentrated. The Arctic trade war is therefore not just about ice and ships. It is about who writes the next chapter of global trade governance. The decisions being made now, often quietly and without public debate, will determine whether the Arctic becomes an open corridor managed collectively or a fragmented zone controlled by a few dominant powers. The ice is retreating, but the lines of competition are hardening, and as the Arctic opens, the space for neutrality closes. The Arctic trade war has begun, and its outcome will shape how goods move, how power is exercised, and how influence is distributed in a world where geography is changing faster than politics can keep up.